I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I spend most of my working and even sometimes non-working time in the trenches on implementation of climate and energy policy here in California. So we're moving forward with a 33% renewable portfolio standard. We're doing energy efficiency standards, very often first in the nation energy efficiency standards. We're permitting renewable energy, we're planning for renewable energy. We are, at the Energy Commission, administering funding programs, the Public Interest Energy Research Program, which is now phasing out and moving forward with the EPIC program, which is more similar public interest, energy-focused research. We're administering an alternative fuels and vehicles research development and deployment program. And so I spend a lot of time just about every day thinking through the details of how to make these things work. And when you get to the question of how to make these things work on the ground, even in a state with as much going for it in terms of history in environmental policy and ability to carry out environmental policy, it's really challenging. And it's challenging particularly to look at what has to be done on a global scale. And I have to admit I spend a lot less time doing that. A, because it's not really the day job that I work for the state of California to perform, but B, because it's really hard. And every time, and some of my comments, I'm looking at some of what I found to be really kind of promising and encouraging out of these chapters that we've looked at, and some issues that you know, you might euphemistically call barriers, or you might more directly say, how on earth are we going to overcome these challenges pertaining to dealing with climate change on a global level at the scale at which we need to act and in the time frame in which we need to act. And it's extraordinarily challenging. So point number one that I would make, and I think it's really the big one in terms of the challenges, is that, you know, we saw from the energy and environment chapter that to stay below the 2-degree threshold for warming from greenhouse gas emissions that I think we all want to stay below. In fact, it would be nice to keep emissions a little lower so that we don't have to hit that 2 degrees of warming. We'll need global emissions of greenhouse gases to begin to decline this decade. And in California, we're doing that. In California, with AB 32, we're on track to go down to 20% below 1990 levels in 2020. We're going to stay on that track. We are actively talking about how to set and meet a higher target. And we've got a higher target in place by executive order. The agencies are planning for a 80% below 1990 levels by 2050 target. That's what's in place by executive order right now. At a global scale, not so easy. Lots of reasons why. One of the reasons why that came through very clearly in the energy and economy chapter is just very simple econ demo. You go to the very basics of how you forecast demand and look at economic factors, demographic factors, the move to the cities, the change to more energy intensive industries. You can see that there is a tremendous amount of built-in or programmed-in momentum towards higher emissions. And in fact, the chapter even indicates that these factors, just urbanization, industrialization, increasing demand for more energy-intensive goods and services at a global level, if these trends continue, could lead us to be using more energy over the next half century than all of recorded history. Well, that's pretty stark, isn't it? Because on one hand, we're saying we'd better move the curve downward in a decade, and on the other hand, we're saying we've got kind of baked into the pie trends that could have us, in fact, moving the curve of energy use upward. We could break records in terms of energy use. Now, it's not an unsolvable problem. It's a hard problem to solve. And it's a problem at a scale that is challenging to even think about. Another point on just barriers or challenges is the level of investment needed. To just meet the energy need, the energy demand, that this trend, this economic and demographic and social and commercial change that's occurring throughout the globe, to meet the energy demand. B, to transform energy systems into sustainable low-carbon energy systems. The level of investment is pretty high. When I first read the numbers out of the Energy and Economy chapter, I thought they were kind of staggering. I took a walk, started thinking about it, and I've come around to the point of view that $20 trillion over the next 25 years to keep up with demand, and $1.7 to $2.2 trillion annually. It's very high. From the point of view of somebody who administers or takes part in administering government RD&D programs, I'll just say that this scale of funding is never, ever, ever going to come from the public sector, ever. Ever. Not even the slightest sliver of significance of that amount of money. Now, that doesn't mean that public R&D isn't important. It's tremendously important. We have done so much with publicly funded programs to leverage private money in directions that are helpful. We've done so much with government regulation to put in place incentives and to put in place disincentives, and sometimes absolutely to put in place absolute prohibitions. You will not sell this television in California because it does not meet our standards into place to help drive private investment. But really, this sum of money, if it's going to be met, is going to be met through the private sector. And so we've got to think about how to do that. There are a number of positive findings in the report as well. Findings on co-benefits. We talk a lot about that in California. It's important to us. Why do we do a lot of the policies we do? Why do people support us in doing a lot of the policies we do? And so I really think that these chapters are very helpful. Help us define the problem, help us define scale, time frame in which to act, and to think about solution set, and a solution set that's appropriate to the scale and time frame. So I'll be happy to speak more, but I think my 5 minutes is about up, so we can go on to the next panelist.
Thanks very much. Martha.
Okay, I've got mine on now. In addition to having been at the Department of Energy, I also was at the California Energy Commission and ran the peer program when Karen was chairman. Where you sit determines what you often think about first. And so now I'm at UC Davis, recently ranked as the #1 agricultural research university by a British organization. So some of my comments are going to reflect on that. I didn't read the whole, even the 400 pages of chapters, and I give Karen credit for that. I read the 114-page document, and some of the comments that I have are really in that context, both the policy summary and the technical summary. What I noticed first and foremost was that the connection between energy and agriculture, as described in terms of biomass, is really mostly associated with land use competition between food, fiber, and fuel. And I think the problem in energy and agriculture is much more complicated than that. In order to solve it, you need to think about water. And that is not so simple as we've learned in California, and particularly some studies done by the Energy Commission. It's fairly simple to think about, and I'm thinking about this not so much in terms of the document itself, because it's really a remarkable achievement that so many of you should take and do take credit for. But when you think about next steps, however you go forward with this, the relationship between energy and water is clear. Water produces power. It's also needed to cool power plants. The relationship between food and water is easy. But in a place like California, and I suspect increasingly as we see climate change in other parts of the world, this California story is instructive, and it's really, I'm going to do this very quickly. 90%, in terms of the consumptive use of water, 90% of the water in California goes to agriculture, 10% goes to urban environments, and that will probably change. But the water system that brings that water to either place, associated with pumping, transport, treatment, 20% uses 20% of our total electricity generated. This was 2005 numbers, and 33% of natural gas use. Some of that natural gas is associated with producing electricity. Some of it is on-farm use for pumping. The transport emissions on farms are not regulated with respect to the regions that they're, where they're produced. And this has an impact on air quality, which feeds back into constraints on fossil and biomass power plant siting. And there are other issues associated with water quality that have impacts on, for example, solar power siting in the Central Valley of California. In the broader context for the world, for other parts of the world, I found an interesting article about the 2012 failure of the monsoon in India. The farmers overpumped, basically drew electricity from the power system, and there was a major power failure, which took days to weeks in some parts of the country to repair because of cooling needs to restart the coal and the nuclear power plants. In yesterday's New York Times, there was a Kansas farmer who was talking about the price of pumping water so that he could farm last year, and he's essentially, and it was about $20,000 a month, and that goes to basically, drawing electricity to run the pumps so they can raise the water from the ground, and the aquifer is basically tapped out in Kansas. So these stories, I believe, in this area will multiply and amplify in the developing world. And so I think this is an area that one needs to think about a little more subtly than what I saw in the document. The other thing that I noticed, and I reflect on this both from my federal and my state service, is this conflict or ambiguity, perhaps, between a call for transformational change and regulatory stability or policy robustness, I think, that is reflected in a couple of comments. And I think that it is going to be impossible not to have major, there will be revolutionary changes in policy and the regulatory environment. Although, as Karen put it so well, California is an amazingly inventive, exploratory laboratory for democracy, and especially with respect to climate change and energy policy. But even for us, it's not simple. And the examples that I think, one of the examples, for example, that I know she struggles with, the California Energy Commission basically puts in place energy efficiency standards that are the most rigorous and far out in the country. And yet, when you get down to building inspectors that have to basically verify that that they're being met, we're basically, we have to depend on cities and counties. The other example of something that I think is very valuable and worthwhile that has happened here is we passed a sustainable communities planning law 4 years ago now, to tie transportation planning with greenhouse gas emission reductions. This is a very, very hard thing to do. It actually, the regions and cities produce transportation plans. They do not produce, at this point yet, greenhouse gas emissions reduction plans. So this is another thing that is going to be transformational when it occurs.
Well, thank you very much. So we're going to have to end at 12:05. So we'll have about 10, 15 minutes of panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to about 10 minutes of questions from the audience. So that's where we're going. And let me kick this off with a question, which I'll not direct anybody in particular on the panel, but feel free to answer. Maybe Kurt is a logical one. Since a major theme of the GEA is the great acceleration, which I think is a wonderful word, with a transformation of much of the population of the developing world to the developed world. We're seeing it in China, we're seeing it in India, and of course if you fast forward 50 years, the world will look like a very different place. Kirk, not Kurt. So the question is, what are the health implications of energy consumption in the developed world? For instance, do super insulated houses present a potential health problem? Can you elaborate on this? Because if we're successful in this great acceleration, that's where the action is going to be in health on the consumption side rather than the production side.
Okay, there is a section in the chapter on this, as you probably know. And yes, there are trade-offs between energy efficiency and indoor air quality, for example, in developed country housing. But I mean, it depends on how you look at it. They're not going to be the major health problems of developed countries. The major health problems of developed countries are smoking, obesity, cholesterol, lack of physical activity, and so forth. They don't come up close to those type of things. So it depends on how you look at it. Sure, there's a difference between one house and another in terms of health risk, but it depends on how you frame it. And I would say, if you look at that chapter, a lot is known about that, and with good building codes, but also enforcement of them, you can avoid a large part of that.
I'll just say that I looked at that part of the chapter with some interest because we do regulate building standards, and working on indoor air quality issues, how much is sufficient ventilation, those are just part and parcel of doing building standards at this point. So houses that are built to code have specific requirements for ventilation. Same thing with parking garages and offices and structures. It's a very robust area in need of more research and more work, and it's developing, but it's a very important part of the standards.
Okay, so here's my question for Kurt. The GEA underscores the importance of energy affordability. It's one of the goals. We've heard it this morning quite a bit, which put differently means keeping energy cheap. Of course, we all know there's a tension between affordability and moderating consumption through higher prices. So the question is, how do you justify this goal? And how do you see the trade-offs between affordability and managing consumption? Wouldn't it be better to have energy non-affordable?
Well, from my perspective, and there are people here from various parts of the world who, if they may see it a little differently than I do, I'm not going to try to focus on the United States, but from my knowledge, as you One of the primary functions of modernizing energy and electricity is job creation. Countries that have a good, reliable power system attract many jobs. This country's become the largest exporter of manufacturing jobs, not totally because of our electricity system, but certainly to a degree. And so that is important. And so I think that raising costs can be made up by the job creation and the income creation that is resulting from it. So I think that there is no reason, in my experience, why the investment cannot be made. Just like there was investments made all over the world to be able to have cell phones and get into the internet and all. It's a similar process here.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
You know, I'd like to add just that keeping energy affordable is not necessarily the same thing as cheap. There are a lot of things that you can do to keep energy affordable, even when policies are having some upward pressure on energy prices. For example, energy efficiency means people use less energy, and so per unit they pay more, but they get the same services for about the same bill. And that's been the experience generally in California, that we have average to lower bills, we have higher rates. The other thing that we do, and that I think is very important, is we do have low-income programs. There's strong public support for low-income programs. It's just because a bill is subsidized for a low-income family does not mean that the energy to them is cheap. They still have incentives to the extent they can to conserve, but keeping energy affordable within a policy framework that also achieves our environmental goals, I think is doable, and I think it's a different thing fundamentally than a cheap energy policy. A cheap energy policy doesn't have incentives to conserve for anyone.
And within reason, cost also encourages efficiency across the board. So that, and there is a tremendous opportunity for efficiency. Our energy globally is not nearly as efficient as it could be. So we are wasting and causing considerable global environmental and health problems by the amount of wasted energy. And so if we have a little price push for higher efficiency, I think that can also be a benefit.
Well, that's going against the affordability. If you want a price push for more efficiency, that means making the energy more expensive.
Yeah, right. Yes, it does make it somewhat more expensive. But again, the end result is when you pay the bill, and it's not necessarily the amount per unit, it's how much I use. So if I pay more for a unit, but I can use less units, I may not end up having a higher bill. Yes, sir.
Well, taking the angle from the third world, one of the most pernicious trade-offs there, perhaps the most, is the trade-off between very dirty fuels that are cheap.
What was it?
Very dirty fuels that are cheap. Mm-hmm. So that's a trade-off we should take out of the system. Provide alternatives that are clean and cheap, or cheap enough for these populations, and that's a huge benefit that we can get. But right now, the easy thing to do is to go out and gather stuff from the environment and burn it in your kitchen, on your kitchen floor, and it serves your cooking purpose, but is not sustainable in terms of health or planetary impacts. So that's something that needs to be stripped out of the option mix by providing alternatives.
Yeah, I could just comment that when I used to live in Africa, rural Africa, and propane was, you could buy propane in the market without any trouble, but it was more expensive than just getting the firewood or the charcoal or the dung that was locally available. So it wasn't the availability, it was the relative prices that were the problem. So one chapter that we skipped over here, but it's in this scoping framework for cluster 1 is security, and I'd like to just pose a question. Nobody here has addressed this, but it's in the GEA as a chapter. To what extent are international conflicts over energy supply or climate change the greatest risks to the world over the coming century, and to what extent aren't they? And more importantly, how do we manage them? Do we just wait for them to arrive, or is there something that can be done to manage them? Just look at the recent wars in the world and ask yourself how many of them are due to at least energy as a mitigating factor. Anybody want to address that on behalf of the missing speakers for that chapter?
Well, I'll say something, but it's not so much that there's a risk associated with or how the risk would change in the framework of climate change. But in fact, if you look at the United States Department of Defense and what they are doing in the wake of having spent 10 years moving fuel and people around in Afghanistan and Iraq, they are not only concerned and investing in more efficient ways to use energy here in the United States when the troops are at home, but in, I think it was 2010, and this is something that the Congress and the administration are together on. The Congress, then not exactly known for working together, created an organization in the Department of Defense called the Office of Operational Energy. It started up in 2008, started up in 2009 with the Obama administration, and its budget is increasing in the wake of an overall decrease for the Department of Defense, and they are focused on, bringing troops into the battlefield with cleaner energy, less energy, and, from all that I have seen in presentations that I've been party to, they are, they will change the way we carry out war in the battlefield. So I think, that it's certainly motivating the Department of Defense.
I'll just add briefly. I agree with Martha. The Department of Defense and the military bases in California have been really helpful partners with the state in innovating and trying out energy technologies and policies and working with us on where to site and permit renewable energy facilities in the desert. They've got aggressive goals to reduce their use of fossil fuels on bases in California, and they're serious about meeting those goals. So that's very helpful. The only other thing I would say on that point is that to the extent that our policies help us reduce our energy use and develop domestic supplies through renewable energy, biofuels, and other sources, they do help reduce the scale of that problem, although it's a big problem.
This is probably the time when we should turn to the audience for any questions you may have. I have some additional questions here, but I think you know more about this than I do. Yes, please identify yourself and your organization.
Siwam Sangi from the International Food Policy Research Institute. I just wanted to insert a comment because...
Can you hold the microphone just a little closer to your mouth?
I wanted to insert a comment because there was some talk about the burden on women and especially the cost of energy. And just to point out, because we don't cost unpaid time very well, the time that's spent by women going out and collecting firewood, if you look at water collection is usually the top one, and then after it is usually firewood collection. And on the flip side, because of the health effects of particulate emissions, the burden of care and nurture is also usually on women, and that's also uncosted. So just to make a comment that we're a long way from really accounting for the economic costs of some of these things, and it's partly because of data. We don't often have time use data of that detail.
Good point. Other questions? Yes, Sally. Christians, where's the microphone? So actually, the microphone's over by this gentleman here, so let's you go first, and then we'll go to Sally.
Okay.
Please identify yourself.
Yeah, Bas van Ruiven, Integrated Assessment Group at NCAR. I have a question on the energy and economy chapter or remark, in the sense that if you read the economy pages in journals, the main thing the economy in the end is interested seems to be energy prices. On the other hand, what we as energy economists want is the economy to invest more into the right direction. And I was wondering whether you can shed some light on, well, next to writing these kind of reports for policymakers, actually find ways to seduce or show to the global economy how to shift its investments in the direction that we want for these transformation pathways, so that they actually will happen in the next 10, 20 years, because that's probably a much stronger force in the world than policy.
I will, since you're referring to that chapter, I would just give you a comment, although it's not really in the chapter.
Can I just ask, is the question, how do you actually accomplish these transformation pathways? How do you actually direct the global system to go in that direction? Is that the question?
Well, how do we make sure that the investments go in the right direction?
Investments are there.
Well, I think the most important step, and that's true anywhere in a fairly free country, not just the United States, but everywhere in the world, is to demonstrate to people that this is really something valuable to them. So it's not just a matter of talk from somebody high up or the government. It's demonstrated. Not everybody bought cell phones when they came on the market. They were demonstrated. People bought it in the early adopters and then created further. So I think, and here, electricity, for example, is primarily in the distribution system. It's creating local microgrids in communities, military bases, university campuses and all, that demonstrate the benefits. And that was tremendous. Like, that's what's really led here. Hurricane Sandy, the areas that survived Hurricane Sandy without being out of power for literally weeks were these few communities and universities that had self-sufficient, highly secure, reliable power systems with local generation. So that, to me, is the model, and that can be done all over. And in India, of course, electrification, in my experience with India, was we're not going to spend long wires because people will tear them down and sell the copper. We're going to electrify locally, and those microgrids. But as you get into communities and bigger cities, it can still be done. So that each substation effectively becomes a microgrid. That's just an example.
Any other reactions to that question? Okay, Sally Benson has a question. Can we have a microphone up here?
Thanks very much. Kirk, I was really taken with your charts showing how much you had to reduce the exposure before you started getting the health benefits for pneumonia and heart attacks and or heart problems and so forth. And I guess my takeaway from that is that we should never, ever burn biomass. It simply seems that burning biomass is not, the health effects of that are simply too great. And so then if you think about this, that, we've got, about 2 billion people, who use wood or biomass, dung, whatever, for cooking and warming and so forth. Who's really stepping up to this, enormous challenge to provide an alternative? And what do you think those alternatives are?
Okay, that's a very good question. Yes, nobody should burn any solid fuel in a household, coal or biomass. But that's, what are we, 100 years out before we can say that. Actually, burning wood is not so great even in first world. I mean, the biggest source of outdoor air pollution at Stanford campus in the winter is biomass combustion, wood fireplaces. It's very difficult to burn cleanly, but we're talking about much higher levels, obviously, in the developing country households. So there are basically 3 billion people cooking with solid fuels every day. And I divide them up in sort of three groups. So the top billion, they're on buying fuel in various ways. They're buying coal, they're buying biomass, they may be buying kerosene, which is also very dirty fuel. They are in the market. They're, not wealthy, but they're not the dollar a day group. They can actually be moved to LPG, I believe. A serious effort to extend the LPG network into that group is clearly possible. And one of the side effects of the fracking business, of this huge excess, or entry of natural gas onto the world market, is a great surplus of LPG, because LPG comes from natural gas production, as they'll call natural gas liquids. So the LPG prices are lower than they've been, but it's also a very convoluted international market. But somebody to get on top of that, now you ask who's doing it. Well, the World LP Gas Association, which is the trade association of the LP gas industry, has stepped up. They've said they're going to want a billion extra consumers. So that top billion they're targeting to do something about. Now, how far along are they? Have they got the funding? Have they got the buy-in from? They're trying to do it out in a private-public partnership. That's, that they're working on it. That middle billion, if you will, I think that's amenable to advanced biomass combustion systems, and there are several technologies that look pretty good. They all use electricity, however. I've never seen a really clean device that doesn't have a blower in it to really stabilize and make the combustion clean enough that you'd want to have it in your own kitchen. Would you want your own daughter to be using it, or your grandmother, or whatever? So we are in the household cooking business. Our fate is tied to electrification, because the more you can electrify, the more better appliances you can have. You can pick off the cooking tasks, a rice cooker, a water heater, and so forth. Why? Nobody should be cooking rice with an open flame. Rice cooker works great. But you have to have electricity, and reliable electricity to do that. So our fate is tied to that. But that second billion down there has already got some electricity, not very reliable. So that's where electrification, efforts are important for many reasons, for welfare. But this is another one, to pick off cooking tasks with cleaner devices. The bottom billion, however, that are really poor, are just gathering their fuels, aren't participating much in the market. That's a challenge. And we have some ideas of how to approach. You asked the question, so we have ideas of working through the health system, because the health system does try to target that bottom billion. We're working through what's called the antenatal care system, the prenatal care for pregnant women, poor pregnant women in India, with the idea that's the most vulnerable group there is, a pregnant woman using a biomass, in this realm, using a biomass fuel for cooking, her and her unborn child. So, but they're already in the system for the health sector. They're already getting a set of benefits. So they're some sort of model that would be, we give them other benefits. Why not give them an advanced stove if it works? So we're trying to develop ways to do that. So those three segments, we have some ideas in each of these segments. But basically, the long term, you're right. Nobody should be using biomass in a household for health purposes.
We have time for one, maybe two questions. And please identify yourself, too.
Dirk Mawitzer, Renewable Analytics. First of all, I would like to say thank you. That's a tremendous report, and it holds lots of information. I have just read a little bit of the outline we have here on the tables. What I'm wondering about is, are you covering energy storage in the report? As a whole industry is moving away from centrally generated electricity to more decentral electricity, energy storage becomes way more important, especially as energy is produced intermittent.
That's a great question.
Yeah, excellent question. Very good you brought it up. I think it will be brought out and emphasized in the afternoon. But certainly storage is a very important, and the technology for storage is advancing dramatically. Not just batteries, but varieties of activities. And even transportation can become a storage vehicle, literally. For electricity. And so storage in a variety of ways is there, and much of what we throw away today could be really storage and could be reused immediately rather than wasted.
Yeah.
So those are just a few comments. I'm sure there'll be others talking this afternoon about that.
I'm afraid we're out of time. You had an announcement you wanted to make.
Okay, well, thank you. Just wanted to let you all know that the Sustainable Silicon Valley here, which has all the companies and organizations, universities and communities here in Greater Silicon Valley, has a global sustainable future project. And I submitted to the competition for that competition a global energy assessment. And it, out of the 130 or more proposals and competitive projects that were put in, this is one of the top 10, and there will be a big award banquet and so forth, discussion banquet on Thursday at NASA Ames, just around the corner. So anyway, I think that's just, again, another indication that the global energy assessment was viewed as a very important contributor to all of these variety of organizations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panelists today.